I think I would re-emphasize the idea that the focus is really not on just creating an X-road-like system across the world or creating an Aadhaar-like system across the world. The focus is on figuring out which systems enable the government to create the ability, again, for individuals and other actors to do authentication, to do transactions, to do the exchange of data.
Welcome to the Digital Government Podcast. Tune in to discover the future of governance and ways of getting there.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Digital Government Podcast with your usual host, Federico Plantera, researcher and journalist. Today, talking about artificial intelligence from perhaps a different perspective, and connecting it to the topic of digital public infrastructure. We're also gonna kind of ask ourselves the question of where does digital public infrastructure lie in relation to artificial intelligence? Is it beneath? Is it above? Is it within? And we're gonna do that today with Krisstina Rao, who is caring for DPI, Digital Public Infrastructure Governance at Co-Develop. And she's also outgoing research fellow at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and has led the work on the Digital Public Infrastructure Map, which is a global effort, literally global, to understand where these systems exist and what makes them work. Krisstina, welcome to the Digital Government Podcast.
Thanks very much, Federico. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So we're addressing this question today because governments around the world, exactly, because we are sort of like starting from a DPI map, governments around the world are investing exactly in artificial intelligence to modernize the public services. However, as we have seen, not just from research, but also from practice, for example, in connection to the EU-funded technical support instrument project with regional authorities in Germany and Spain, these initiatives, these roadmaps, these plans, and also these activities that are happening right now with public administrations do not operate in a vacuum, in the sense that there are some things that are fundamental components, fundamental elements that otherwise, if they're not there and in place, make AI adoption perhaps more exposed to being built on a fragile ground, let's say. So digital public infrastructure, in connection or not with artificial intelligence, has become a major concept in the global governance discussions. However, there are varieties, there are differences. The concept takes a different shape based on where it is implemented. So, Krisstina, let's start first of all from Co-Develop itself. Like, what is it and what are you going to do there? And then also exactly why should we see this as infrastructure and not just IT systems?
That's great. I think I'll take about 20 minutes of this podcast to just explain the term. But okay, first things first. Yes, my new role is at Co-Develop, and Co-Develop is a fund that helps governments, but also other actors implement, adopt, design digital public infrastructure. It's a fairly new fund, but it cares that governments are now looking at DPI, digital public infrastructure, as a sort of frontier of how to digitalize services and how to enable participation in society. And that's the outcome that it really cares about. Within Co-Develop, I kind of work more specifically on the governance of these systems, and my background is in the social sciences, so I naturally care about how the technology bit of it interacts with the society bit of it. And so that's what I'll focus. You'll see a lot of that lens come out in our discussion today. A little bit about digital public infrastructure, since it might be new to this forum and a lot of listeners here. The term is not too old. And if you put it up in Google or you ask LLM, you're going to probably get a bunch of different definitions. A disclaimer is that the definition changes based on who you ask the definition from. And this really matters. The term only got officially coined and reached like a policy lexicon in 2023 under the G20, India's chairmanship at G20. And they came up with a definition that emphasized on shared digital infrastructures. If you speak with technical players who are trying to define DPI and talk about how digital systems should look like, they'll emphasize attributes like interoperability, extensibility. And then the bit that really resonates with me and resonates with our work at UCL is it's all great that this is a new technology or seemingly a new technology, but why does it matter to the public sector and why does it matter to the government? I think that resonance really comes from its focus on public sector capabilities and the ability of governments and states to facilitate participation in society and in markets more broadly. So, beware if you're Googling digital public infrastructure for this episode, you're going to find different definitions. But that's hopefully where our work at UCL can really help move the needle in helping understand what DPI means. We've created the map, as you mentioned, Federico, which is really a project to scope out systems like DPI across the globe. And we've realized these definitional variations are a problem to actually understanding what the concept is. So we did a fairly academic exercise of figuring out where are all these definitions, what are they saying about the attributes of DPI, and can we arrive at common attributes that all of these definitions agree on. So we came up with 6. It has an equal emphasis on governance as it does in the technology, and it emphasizes adoption, which matters a lot to kind of characterizing DPI as different from all the other digital transformation efforts that have come before it, because it cares very much that a government is trying to facilitate participation for individuals, for businesses, for other actors in society at large. And that means participation in society, but it also means participation in markets. It means a government is not playing the only role in developing, operating, organizing the system. It's working with other actors to create a symbiotic ecosystem. I'll pause there. I hope that offers a direction, and I hope we can build from here.
Yes, and it offers me also a bit of a hook to when I actually first learned about the existence of the digital public infrastructure map, which was last year during the community event of Extrode, actually, of the Nordic Institute for Interoperability Solutions. I remember you had a presentation there. You showed the map, and as soon as, obviously, exactly, as a researcher, as soon as I saw an interactive map where I can visualize and then have kind of like case studies from the countries about digital public infrastructure implementation, and obviously it was all about it. And I wanted to know. What was going on basically with this project. And then later in the end of the year, I think you also have published the status of digital public infrastructure report, if I'm not wrong. So, but one thing, so for example, even now, asking this question, I was about to say regions, but then I corrected to countries, because your research exactly so far has focused, at least for the digital public infrastructure map, has focused primarily at a national level, I would say, no? And people are always interested in seeing, but like, let me see, I don't know, maybe when you're presenting it, where is Spain? And like, or where is Estonia? And how is Germany doing? However, if then the topic of digital public infrastructure is almost inherently related to context and variation, that means that there is even more so at the regional and local level, right? When or where capacity, governance, but also like resources, they vary enormously even within the same country, especially, for example, for bigger economies I would think of, or also countries that have perhaps a pretty net urban, rural, regional divide, let's say, within their own geographies and their own countries. In that sense, and in that line of thinking, do you see the concept of, or the lens, let's say, of digital public infrastructure then extend also to these subnational contexts, but taken in a rather, let's say, general way of the term? So like with the different variations, let's say, of levels of governance that we could find below the national level.
Short answer, yes. But I will add the caveat, and I am a researcher still. I will add the caveat that this is being negotiated and defined right now. I'll go back to the definition I just brought up, which is around shared digital infrastructure. Whether this infrastructure is then shared between entities at the subnational level, at the national level, maybe cross border, cross countries, as it happens in Europe, is expansively defined. What matters is that if a certain digital infrastructure is being used for the same purpose across different geographies, why are we building it over and over again and having these systems work in silos? Why can't it be the same system that speaks to each other across bridges or the same system used by different entities? I think the goal is that. But the reality, and you kind of touched upon this a little bit in your question, which is DPI is looking very different across countries, across regions. And the reason for that is not everyone is starting from the same stage of digital transformation or public sector capabilities when they start thinking about what it means to share digital infrastructures within government or across governments. And Estonia, for example, that is now considered one of the most digitally forward countries in the world. They started in 1991, where post independence they built from scratch, pretty much with a blank slate. And now they have a very sophisticated ecosystem that is digital first. Many other countries have started building before 1990s, but they started with analog systems. So they had to do the job of moving analog to digital. And sometimes a certain sector, like say the health sector, has been very forward with digitizing health records, with digitizing health information systems. They've kind of led the effort to get the other sectors in the same country to think forward. If you look at countries again with different capabilities and capacities, like for example in the global south, they are again starting with different levels of civil registries, of just registries and databases. And they are thinking of how to then deal with almost like a fragmented puzzle of connecting and building bridges between different systems rather than building a system from scratch. And this is very important. Like these are all examples, but the principle to take away from all of this is that DPI is not a monolith, that it looks very different in different contexts, and that's okay because the focus is not on how the system looks or trying to replicate the same model across the world, because we're not going to be successful at that, and that's not the goal. The focus is very much, again, shared digital infrastructures to enable participation in society and markets. And this kind of emphasizes something that's invisible in this definition, which is what kind of participation needs to be facilitated, what kind of functions do governments need to work on. And that can be, like our paper talks about, our work talks about, in a digital society, that's typically authentication, it's transactions, it's the exchange of data. And we're realizing that sometimes within a country, the federal government and the national government is taking the first foray into thinking of this as infrastructure. Sometimes it's the state government, and sometimes it's a subnational government. And there's nothing that defines this sort of propagation of the idea going only upwards or going only downwards. Some degree of maybe a nucleatic idea spreading from a federal level helps because it gives organizing principles to subnational governments. But we've also seen contexts where, say, for example, there are a lot of smart city projects that enable best practices at the subnational level, and that gives the federal government and the central government a sort of unifying idea of what to make a guideline for the rest of the country. So it can flow both ways, to answer your question.
Yeah, one thing exactly connected to the topic of transferability is that I could easily imagine, like someone maybe from a regional government or like a national government seeing a presentation about digital public infrastructure and how that has taken shape in different contexts successfully. And then, for example, kind of like having almost like a reflex-based answer or like a reactive answer of like, but it's about that context in my place or like in the place where I am from, it is different. I don't know if it would work and so on. So the variation, in your opinion, in any case, does not complicate the idea that digital public infrastructure can be a transferable model in itself. Because in any case, as we said, we're not talking about a monolith scheme, let's say, or like a frame, but rather the ability to interpret this variation, I would think.
Most definitely. And there, I think I would re-emphasize the idea that the focus is really not on maybe just creating an X-road-like system across the world or creating an Aadhaar-like system across the world. The focus is on figuring out which systems enable the government to create the ability, again, for individuals and other actors to do authentication, to do transactions, to do the exchange of data. And while doing the DPI map, we found this. We're still constantly confronted with the idea that, oh, if a country, say, for example, has multiple IDs that enable the exchange of data for transactions to occur, should we count all of those IDs? In principle, the answer should be yes. But a sort of criteria would be, do the IDs speak to each other, or are they facilitating further silos to be created because they're not actually interoperable? And you can't actually have a common shared piece of infrastructure that you can build on top of and enable across different use cases. So that's, I think, working on a data project to make a very seemingly ambiguous definition more empirically grounded has been a really exciting project for us because it's allowed us to test exactly this. But we're constantly confronted with these definitional confusion sometimes to say, what does shared mean? What does interoperability truly mean? And where does the buck stop with, is it only national? Is it only regional? Is it subnational? What does it look like? And we've realized there's common starting points based on why you need the definition for what kind of cutoff decision. You're allowed to sort of play around with the map and the criteria on the map to call something DPI-like or not something DPI-like. And that's the fun in a database project, but it also means that it won't give you a very solid answer if you have a question on a definitional topic.
But this was also one of the things that you found out, while researching exactly, and it's that in light of the topic of the variation that we spoke about, in light, in any case, of the basic elements that are, let's say, eligible as macro categories to look at digital public infrastructure, which is exactly digital identity, data exchange, and digital payments as well. And that's another one of the three base macro categories. Then exactly, you saw that there are many solutions, in the sense, solutions to problems that have been created locally and that perhaps, don't even need to fit necessarily a solid definition of digital public infrastructure alone, but they can be also digital public infrastructure like. So let's say in the ballpark of what digital public infrastructure is and means. While researching through all the countries of the world in this global tour of digital public infrastructure, first of all, I think that one of the interesting things that people have noticed is also that these foundational systems are more prevalent perhaps than people think, which I would say is also at the basis of why people are curious to see, wait, but so how is the situation in my country? Perhaps it's because they don't really know about what qualifies, let's say, as a digital public infrastructure like system in their own countries. But then, is there something that the data and the research revealed that you did not expect? Or is there maybe some general conclusions as well that we can derive about how governments are approaching this topic overall? Are there some general trends?
Yeah, it's been a while now since we've been talking about, it's been about 2 years since UCL has been publishing on the topic, if not more, and trying to frame and add data to how we're defining DPI and talk about DPI. So I might not remember what was surprising, but I will say and reiterate what you just said, which is that this whole idea that there's way more DPI out there than we thought was itself not proven. It was a hypothesis. It even maybe contradicted what some people thought within the DPI bubble. And I acknowledge myself as belonging to it because I've been in every conversation, I'm using the word DPI at least 3 times. Even in the bubble, I think when we have to talk about, what is this new thing called DPI and which governments are using it, we could only come and maybe count 5 on our hand. There was, of course, Estonia, there's India, there's Brazil. But we realize there's stories that kind of predate the term digital public infrastructure. They existed, like Singapore was doing it much earlier. There were countries in Africa doing it much earlier in terms of just thinking of shared digital infrastructures, but they were just not calling it digital public infrastructure. So just having data to tell this story now, that there are some, last I checked on the DPI map, there's about 57 identity systems across the world that can be considered DPI. Like, I couldn't name them right now as I can after looking at the website. But when I look at the map, I can say, oh, the reason why they're called DPI is because they meet this criteria of enabling digital authentication, of being used by multiple departments, of being actually actively used by individual citizens, businesses, etc. So actually having the data to just say the same thing we kind of had been speculating for a while was, I think, a very validating experience, because I don't think DPI is as new as people have been led to believe. I think it's been existing. But what the contours of it from, the implementations that came before 2023 look like, we only know now. And that is as a researcher, I'm very excited about that finding, because previously it was only a speculation.
Krisstina, I'm wondering something now, just a side question or a side quest, let's say, for a second. And it is the fact that the topic or the lens or the term itself of digital public infrastructure, let's say, is relatively young. Does it have any consequence or any effect, let's say, on how people outside the DPI bubble that you have mentioned perceive and approach the theme?
That's a really good question. Maybe I can surface some work we've been thinking about. We're trying to locate this thing called DPI in a sort of historical perspective of what digital government looked like. So digital government can go as far back as the 1980s, where we're thinking of analog to digital, and governments were still very much operating in silos and saying, digitize the tax system, and then you digitize the driving license department, and you digitize something else. And they're all building their own layers around, this is how we identify that this person owes this tax, it speaks to this register, it speaks to this authentication layer, so on and so forth. It was still very much happening in silos. There was no unifying entity trying to think through digital across government. Then somewhere, was it 2011, that something like GDS was launched, or just this whole idea of government service units came about, where it almost acted like a nucleus to say, hey, we kind of realize that this idea around digital is helping us think through how health service delivery happens, and how education happens, and how a bunch of these other departments and use cases get enabled. So why don't we adopt common principles to think through all of this? And the principles meant, making similar procurement decisions, making similar tech adoption decisions, things like that. But it still didn't mean that it was solving for something fundamental within the government. And now we're kind of seeing that there's this new DPI thing happening. But what does it mean for it to be new? What is the newness of it? What are its characteristics is something we've been questioning. And a thought that we've stayed with, and not only a thought, we've seen this in evidence across deployments, is that the focus is suddenly in not so much the technology, it's in the role of the government. And the government is kind of reframing how they think of not only service delivery, but also creating an ecosystem that is digitally enabled. And but ecosystem means, again, society and markets. It's not only thinking of the kind of value chains and services that it delivers is, through utilities or through public services. It's also saying, hey, if a market exists and someone needs to participate in, I don't know, using digital infrastructure to, you're a health startup and you want to use an ID's authentication platform to figure out who to deliver this startup service to, you should be able to. And the government should create this public utility. And this whole idea that the government has a role to play in enabling market conditions through digital infrastructures is very new. And I think this is something to sort of re-emphasize the newness of DPI. Yes, in some ways, we've not had this lexicon and we've not had this term, but it's to kind of also acknowledge that other disciplines have been rethinking the role of the state and the role of the government. And we're acknowledging that the government could actually have a more active role to play in figuring out who participates, under what conditions, what sort of utilities do they use and infrastructures do they use to participate, and things like that. And of course, this is studied mostly through a digital government lens, which is why it sort of plants DPI firmly in this space. But there's also, say, economics as a field has been trying to think of how infrastructure is studied generally and what does it mean for value creation and for a sort of shared means to many ends. And this is also work that David has done, and with some other colleagues at UCL, at IPP, that I would encourage people to read. This paper called What is Public About DPI, like what is public in digital public infrastructure, which is very fascinating because people typically think public just means public ownership, government owns everything. But the government doesn't have to own everything. It's actually very inefficient for the government to take on so many burdens. But they're trying to create models where they're enabling private participation, which is very exciting because it's now acting as almost like a nudger and a molder of markets rather than being rather passive in a system where it procures tech for public service delivery, and that's where it draws the line. So this reframing has really come from other fields and trying to contextualize DPI in comparison to the status quo. And that's been exciting.
A few things about that. First of all, yes, I have read that paper. And also David is David Eves, who exactly researches at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College London. I found that paper and what you just said, Krisstina, regarding what does public mean, very interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, because we had also, like we hosted Felix Sieker from Bertelsmann Stiftung at the event, the final event of the technical support instrument project that I mentioned, with exactly a presentation on public AI, which is an interpretation that Bertelsmann Stiftung, together with Open Future, then also reflected in a policy paper that was introduced at the European Parliament in the past few months. But then more instead on my own trajectory, I think that this view of what is public and the fact that public does not mean necessarily that something needs to be owned by a government. When we're not talking about that, though, and today we are most likely talking about enabling functions, let's say, that the government can give to different actors in society, citizens, companies, and it can do so in the very first place by means of public services. And by means of public services that exactly allow different actors in society to do different things. And this is exactly the focus of the EU-funded project that we had in Spain and Germany, where exactly the goal was to understand how to use innovative technologies, including artificial intelligence. So not just focused on artificial intelligence, but including it in this technology catalog of what can make services for entrepreneurs more efficient. However, in connection instead to the topic of digital public infrastructure, going there and seeing basically what is the situation across the land, across the territory, all the different regions basically turn out to have or describe some similar starting conditions in terms of the digital enablers and the elements that we've been talking about under the lens of digital public infrastructure here. So the registries are fragmented. There isn't a unified data architecture. The interoperability, especially, because it's not like there needs to be a huge central register always updated. There could be different ones, but that communicate. And instead also there, for example, interoperability is inconsistent across agencies. So not going to ask here a chicken and egg type of question, like DPI first or AI first. But rather, I would ask you, Krisstina, so what does make sense under the lens of digital public infrastructure? What does it make sense that should be in place, let's say, for a regional government or like for public services to be improved when artificial intelligence enters the picture and people are starting to consider adopting AI tools?
The very fun AI DPI nexus is what you asked me to engage on. There are papers about this. David Eves has also written one. Again, I'll plug that in because it's actually really useful to just think through the convergence. I have a short answer where if listeners are just plugging into the hook for this answer, the answer is data. Data is the common convergence factor. But the way I'll explain it is perhaps through thinking through stacks, the AI stack and the DPI stack. They're framed very differently, but what they actually mean is a public sector technology stack. And a public sector technology stack has more or less the same layers. It has data at the bottom. It has microservices above the data that treat data differently to make it available in different ways. And then it has the application layer on top. The layers 2 and 3 going upwards obviously depend a lot on the quality of the layer at the bottom. If the quality of the layers at the bottom are not good enough, the layers on top of it can't do as good a job as they are meant to. And if the most fundamental, if the bottom layer is data, as it is true for both DPI, where data is treated as registries, and for AI, it's just treated as large data sets. If the data is not good, both DPI and AI are going to fail. So the more common denominator is still data. A way to also perhaps exemplify this idea is when I was working really early on with a federal ministry in India, we were thinking a lot through public sector capabilities and the role that AI could play, what use cases they could enable, given some public interest use cases we had in mind. We were working in the health sector, so we were focused on, what can we use AI to build? It was pre-AI hype a little bit, and the public sector across the world, especially in the global south, was really excited with this idea, and they wanted to do something with it. The starting point for us was not which AI to build and which model to deploy. It was what of our data is good enough for a model to be built on top of it. So it very much went back to the fact of what does public data even look like? Is it stored in PDFs? Is it analog? Does it need to be digitized? If it's digitized already, is it normalized and standardized? Are apples actually apples and oranges actually oranges in this data set? Because it matters, because if you're not putting those codes into the data set, the AI is going to misread it. The model is going to be horrible. And especially in the public interest realm and in any use case that a public sector would touch, the quality of this data really matters. Okay, so we focus on the bottom. Let me zoom out a little bit to the DPI and AI nexus now. DPI is basically a sort of machinery that lets a government and lets a system map itself on a data layer. So if you create an ID system, there's a way to authenticate people. If you create a payment layer, there's a way to enable these individuals and actors to transact with each other. If you make sure that this system is well oiled through a data exchange system, then it's interoperable, it speaks with each other, there's more use cases that can be built on top of it. All of this is really the back end. DPI, if you're starting from scratch, and if you're a government and public sector official starting from scratch, if you don't have this layer already, investing in this now will help you create better data down the line for more use cases to be enabled on top of it. So AI and the success of AI in your department, in the value chains you're concerned with, very much depends on the quality of data in the back end, and DPI kind of enables that. And then similarly, there's a vice versa relationship also, where the existence of AI and use cases that become important in the public sector because AI is bringing attention to it, or because automation to some degree can play a role in a certain agricultural use case or in a health use case or in an education or tax use case, it kind of creates the impetus for that government department to invest more in the machinery that's in the back end. So if you know that down the line you need better quality data for the tax system in order to enable, say, better identification of tax evasion or something like that, you're going to invest in more interoperable layers and better data systems at the bottom, and then a data exchange system. And you're going to make sure the transaction is enabled on top of this, things like that. So they both play a kind of circular role. It is chicken and egg, but it's not as complicated, because investing in one kind of means you're automatically creating an ecosystem and a fertile ground to invest in the other. And they build a case for each other.
Wonderful, Krisstina. We could even close it here, but I will just at this point have just a few sentences back to geography, considering that it had played such an important role in this podcast episode so far, and also because you have just mentioned Global South, but also in general the digital public infrastructure map, the research where we started from, let's say with this episode, exactly covers the entire world. And you can also mention exactly when closing where people can find it, or what are some connected materials to that. One thing that then I would ask you is, if we were to adopt then a digital public infrastructure lens, let's say, to improving and modernizing public services in Europe, do you think that Europe, for example, is paying enough attention to this term, to this topic, and to this lens? And what does digital public infrastructure, given that we have so many examples from the rest of the world, what it could look like also here in the continent?
I feel like Europe has been paying attention, and thanks to the integration that naturally comes with the EU single market and just EU level integration, it means that there's a lot of infrastructures that now the EU has created impetus for, that national systems are building on top of. So TIPS is a really good example, because if you look at the map, for example, and you look at the payment layer across all European countries, you'll find TIPS there that enables real-time transactions. And it has a very sophisticated ecosystem that enables them to do that. The question now is, how is the private market participating in making this payment infrastructure more accessible for different use cases, which is something yet to be solved for. So I would say it's almost embraced the idea of DPI. I think the idea of infrastructure is not new to Europe. It believes in building foundational pieces of infrastructure and has always created an ecosystem for that to build. The question now is, how does it work with markets to really leverage their ability to innovate and make this layer more accessible to industry, to individuals, to different actors in society, which is a question to be solved for. This is particularly important because sovereignty is a big deal in Europe right now. There's a lot of questions around how digital infrastructure can be more secure, how can it be sovereign, and there's different definitions of sovereignty also, but we won't get into that. Sovereignty is an opportunity because DPI kind of speaks to that. It speaks to the ability of nation states, of states, to be able to build their infrastructure in a way that they have some degree of public interest governance capability over it, but at the same time invest in a domestic ecosystem that is really able to stretch this infrastructure, make the most application-centric use cases out of it, things like that. So again, it kind of is going to lead to sovereignty, but also thinking about DPI and DPI lens to its own digital infrastructure is going to make this whole ecosystem more secure and more innovative, which is a big priority for EU industry right now. So I wouldn't think DPI is a global south phenomenon or a realm. I think the DPI map has already proven it. There have been deployments of DPI-like systems in Europe even before the term DPI has been caused. Has been coined. We are now just adding data to what EU used to not call DPI. They used to call it maybe shared infrastructure, maybe public digital infrastructure, something different. Where we're pointing to these systems and offering a model of what the EU model of DPI could look like. And we're offering it as an opportunity to also address topical issues that are relevant to policy priorities in the EU, like sovereignty.
Krisstina, thank you very much for joining us today. This was a super nice conversation.
I enjoyed myself as well. Thank you, Federico.
And that's it for today, also from your usual host, dear listeners to the Digital Government Podcast. And I will see you all tuning in at the next one.
This podcast is brought to you by the eGovernance Academy. Tune in next time.